For decades, Iran held one card above every other. Not its missiles, not its proxies, not even its nuclear program. Its card was a narrow strip of water, barely 21 miles wide at its tightest point, sitting between its own coastline and the small peninsula of Oman on the other side. A waterway so critical, so irreplaceable, that the entire global economy bends around it like iron filings around a magnet. The Strait of Hormuz. Every single day, roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through that corridor. That is 20% of every drop of petroleum consumed on this planet, funneled through 2 shipping lanes, each barely 2 miles wide, squeezed between Iranian-controlled islands and missile batteries carved into mountainous coastlines. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, there is no meaningful alternative route. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pipelines that can redirect maybe 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels a day. The rest? There's nowhere else for it to go. Iran knew this. Iran has always known this. And on February 28, 2026, the day the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in the opening strike, Iran finally played that card. By March the 2nd, a senior IRGC official stood in front of cameras and made it official. The Strait of Hormuz was closed. Not threatened, not partially restricted. Closed. 230 loaded oil tankers were suddenly trapped inside the Persian Gulf. Maersk, CMA CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, every major shipping line in the world suspended transit overnight. Brent crude prices exploded past $100 a barrel by March 8th. They peaked near $126 per barrel. So the IEA reported that in March alone, global oil supply collapsed by 10.1 million barrels per day, the largest single supply disruption in recorded history. Bunker fuel, the diesel of the shipping world, doubled in price from $450 a ton to over $900. Everything that moves by sea became more expensive. Everything. And Iran sat back, watching the world panic, and waited for Washington to blink. Here is what Tehran was thinking. You cannot bomb us into submission, because the moment you try to escalate further, we will turn off the lights for China, India, Japan, and South Korea simultaneously. You cannot negotiate from a position of strength if the world is screaming at you to stop the pain, and you cannot find an alternative, because there is no alternative. It was, from a strategic standpoint, a near-perfect trap. But Iran made one catastrophic miscalculation. It assumed Washington would flinch. Part 2. The IRGC's asymmetric nightmare. Before we get to what the US Navy did, you need to understand exactly what kind of fight Iran was prepared to wage inside those narrow waters, because this is not a conventional naval conflict. What the IRGC has built in the Strait of Hormuz over 40 years is something far more dangerous, far more creative, and far harder to defeat than anyone in the West wanted to admit. Picture the geography first. The Strait's Iranian coastline is not a flat beach. It is a jagged mountainous terrain riddled with sea caves, hidden inlets, and underground tunnels that the IRGC calls wet tunnels, man-made passages carved directly into the rock face, large enough to hide speedboats and fast attack craft below the waterline, completely invisible to satellite surveillance above. Iran controls 3 major islands, Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb, positioned like fortresses directly astride the shipping lanes. From these islands, the IRGC has built a network of underground bunkers loaded with speedboats, drone launch systems, and anti-ship missile batteries. The IRGC Navy does not fight like a conventional Navy. It fights like a swarm. According to Gulf News military analysts, when the IRGC executes an attack on a cargo vessel, they deploy fleets of small speedboats capable of hitting 50 to 70 knots, faster than most naval interceptors. 10 to 20 of these boats descend on a single target simultaneously from 360 degrees, targeting weak points with heavy machine guns and shoulder-fired missiles. They aim for the bridge, to blind the crew, and the engine room, to leave the vessel dead in the water, and hidden inside that swarm, unmanned drone boats, remote-controlled suicide vessels packed with explosives, steered directly into the hull. Then, while the crew is overwhelmed and the ship has stopped, other boats drop tethered naval mines directly into the water around it. The IRGC fleet of small attack craft is estimated at over 1,000 vessels. Over 800 are operational fast attack boats, Boghammer class, Zulfikar class, Ashura class, armed with heavy weapons welded directly onto the hull. The US military, according to multiple reports, had destroyed roughly half of them by April. The other half remained, hiding in wet tunnels, hidden in coves. Ready? And that is before you get to the naval mines. Iran deployed hundreds of moored and magnetic mines throughout the Strait of Hormuz, dropped from small boats under cover of darkness, randomly scattered, drifting with the currents, their exact locations impossible to pinpoint, and according to reports, Iran itself reportedly lost track of some of them. Every gigantic oil tanker that even considered transiting the strait was one lucky current drift away from detonating a mine that could snap its keel in half. Then there are the missiles. Along the rugged Iranian coastline, hundreds of mobile anti-ship missile launchers are concealed inside the mountains, moved constantly to avoid being targeted. The Noor missile, the supersonic Khalij Fars, the Qadr, range sufficient to cover the entire width of the strait and beyond. In the early weeks of the war, Trump himself claimed that Iran had fired 101 missiles at USS Abraham Lincoln, and every single one was intercepted. But the keyword is 101, that is 101 attempts to sink an American carrier. The US defensive systems held, but no defensive system has infinite ammunition. And finally, the drones. Hundreds of Shahed 136 kamikaze drones, loitering munitions, long-range suicide aircraft capable of flying low below radar coverage and striking a billion-dollar warship before it knows the threat is there. This is what Washington was staring at when it decided it needed to take that lock out of Iran's hands. Part 3. Washington pushes the button. For weeks, Trump tried everything short of full escalation. On March 15th, he publicly demanded that NATO and China help the US reopen the strait. They refused. Too dangerous, too complicated. On March 19th, the US military began active mine-clearing operations. 2 Navy destroyers, the USS Frank E. Peterson Jr. and USS Michael Murphy, pierced through the dangerous waters and entered the strait itself. The IRGC's response was immediate. A radio transmission crackled across the Arabian Gulf that naval commanders would not forget. Final warning, final warning, final warning. Divert to the Indian Ocean immediately. U.S. Navy Warship 121. This is Sapon Navy Station. You must alter course and go back to the Indian Ocean immediately. Washington did not alter course. On April 8th, after 40 days of sustained combat, a temporary 2-week ceasefire was agreed. Iran would reopen the strait. Peace talks were scheduled for Islamabad. Hope returned briefly. Then Iran began charging toll fees of over $1 million per ship to transit. Trump called it unacceptable. The blockade of talks continued. On April 11th and 12th in Islamabad, U.S. and Iranian negotiators sat across from each other and reached exactly nothing. J.D. Vance walked out. Trump posted the announcement minutes later. On April 13th, 2026, at exactly 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the United States naval blockade of Iran went into full effect under the command of Admiral Brad Cooper at U.S. Central Command. In the first 24 hours, more than 10,000 U.S. sailors, Marines, and Air Force personnel, supported by over a dozen warships and more than 100 fighter jets and surveillance aircraft, were enforcing the operation. CENTCOM announced that economic trade entering and leaving Iran by sea had been completely halted. 6 merchant ships complied with orders and turned back to Iranian ports without resistance. 0 ships broke through. But the blockade was not simply a wall of destroyers sitting in the water. It was a system, a layered, technologically sophisticated machine designed to find, track, stop, and if necessary, destroy anything moving toward Iranian ports. Here is how it worked. High above, MQ-9 Reaper drones and P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft circled continuously, tracking every vessel in the region through automatic identification system signals and radar. Satellites overhead fed real-time imagery into command centers aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, the legendary carrier strike group that had deployed to CENTCOM's area of operations in January and whose F-35C Lightning IIs and FA-18E Super Hornets controlled the skies over the Arabian Sea. Guided missile submarines equipped with Tomahawk missiles lurked beneath the surface. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit stood ready aboard amphibious assault ships to conduct opposed boarding operations on any vessel that refused to comply. And for the Iranian speedboats hiding in wet tunnels along the coastline, the U.S. deployed their nightmare. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said it directly at a Pentagon press briefing. The A-10 is hunting and killing fast-attack watercraft in the Straits of Hormuz. AH-64, Apache helicopters joined the operation on the southern flank, specifically tasked with intercepting Iranian drone boats and IRGC speedboats before they could reach their targets. The 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted on the nose of each A-10, capable of firing hundreds of depleted uranium rounds per second, is one of the only weapons in the world capable of shredding a 50-knot Iranian speedboat at close range before it completes an attack run. CENTCOM published unclassified video footage of these strikes. Iranian naval assets in the strait exploding on camera, one by one. Within 36 hours of the blockade taking effect, CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper issued a statement. An estimated 90% of Iran's economy is fueled by international trade by sea. In less than 36 hours since the blockade was implemented, U.S. forces have completely halted economic trade going into and out of Iran by sea. Iran was bleeding $400 million a day in lost oil revenue. Part 4, the Touska Incident. But Iran was not finished. On April 14th, just one day after the blockade began, an Iranian-flagged cargo vessel attempted to slip out of Bandar Abbas, exit through the strait, and evade the blockade by hugging the Iranian coastline. It did not get far. The USS Spruance, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, intercepted it, hailed it by radio, and instructed it to turn around. The vessel complied. 10 vessels have now been turned around, and 0 ships have broken through since the start of the US blockade, CENTCOM posted on X. But that was not the end of the USS Spruance's week. 5 days later, on April 19th, a far more serious confrontation unfolded in the Gulf of Oman. An Iranian-flagged cargo ship, nearly 900 feet long, weighing almost as much as an aircraft carrier, named the Touska, was heading from China toward the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas. It was going to challenge the blockade directly. The USS Spruance made radio contact, issued a warning to stop. The Iranian crew did not respond. The Spruance issued another warning, then another. Over the course of 6 hours, U.S. Central Command issued repeated demands for the Touska to evacuate its engine room and comply. 6 hours of warnings. The Iranian crew refused every single one. Trump announced the outcome himself on Truth Social, in language that left no room for ambiguity. The USS Spruance intercepted the Touska in the Gulf of Oman and gave them fair warning to stop. The Iranian crew refused to listen, so our Navy ship stopped them right in their tracks by blowing a hole in the engine room. Right now, U.S. Marines have custody of the vessel. The USS Spruance fired several rounds directly into the engine room of the Touska, disabling it completely. U.S. Marines boarded the vessel. The Touska, already under U.S. Treasury sanctions for prior illegal activity, sat dead in the water in international waters, under American control. It was the first ship fired upon, and the first ship seized since the blockade began. Iran called it maritime piracy. Iran's military spokesperson Ebrahim Zolfaghari appeared on state television. Iran's armed forces would soon respond and retaliate. The new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who had taken power after his father's assassination, issued a statement declaring Iran's navy ready to make the enemies taste the bitterness of new defeats. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood at a Pentagon podium and gave Iran a different message entirely. We can do this all day. Part 5. The real war behind the war. But here is what most coverage is missing entirely. Step back from the ships, the drones, the mines, and the Marine boarding parties for a moment. Look at the larger picture painted on this chessboard. Because what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz is not just a conflict between Washington and Tehran. It is a direct confrontation between the American-led global financial system and the alternative architecture that Beijing has spent 20 years quietly constructing underneath it. China is not a spectator in this crisis. China is at its very center. According to the IEA, in 2025, nearly 34% of all globally traded crude oil passed through the Strait of Hormuz. China and India combined received 44% of those exports. China alone, the world's factory, the engine of global manufacturing, imports roughly 11.6 million barrels of crude oil every single day. Close to 20% of that came from Iran. And critically, Beijing was buying that Iranian oil not in US dollars, but in its own currency, the yuan, bypassing American sanctions, bypassing the SWIFT financial system, building, quietly and systematically, an alternative to dollar-denominated energy trade that stretches from Africa to Southeast Asia. The Strait of Hormuz is the artery that feeds this entire parallel system. And now the lock to that artery is in American hands. When Trump stood in front of the cameras and declared that the U.S. would stop any ship paying tribute to Iran in international waters, he may have been pointing at something far larger than Iranian oil exports. Because nearly 50% of China's crude oil imports must pass through the Strait of Hormuz. If Beijing cannot access cheap Iranian oil, the oil it was buying outside the dollar system, it has no choice but to reroute its massive tanker fleets to far more expensive alternative suppliers. And in doing so, it would be forced back into the dollar-denominated financial system it has spent years trying to escape. The de-dollarization strategy China has woven across decades could unravel against the 127 guns of American destroyers at 41% of the entire deployed U.S. Navy fleet. 3 carrier strike groups, 27 warships, 16 500 sailors and Marines, and now the USS George H.W. Bush carrier group rounding the coast of Africa to join them. This is the largest concentration of American naval power in the region since the 5-carrier buildup, at the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. The USS Gerald R. Ford had been at sea for 296 consecutive days by April 16th, a post-Vietnam War deployment record. And still, they are not backing down. Part 6. The question that changes everything, which brings us to the moment that military strategists across the world are watching for. What happens when a massive Chinese-flagged oil tanker appears on the horizon of the Strait of Hormuz, heading straight for the blockade line? Because that moment is coming, it may already be in motion. If the USS Spruance or the USS Abraham Lincoln Strike Group or any American warship intercepted a Chinese-flagged vessel in international waters and attempted to board it, Beijing could declare it a direct violation of sovereignty, a casus belli, an act of war against the People's Republic. The already crackling South China Sea standoff, where China has simultaneously moved to restrict the Scarborough Shoal, could ignite into something far larger. And if Washington blinks, if it quietly waves a Chinese tanker through, then the entire all-or-nothing blockade strategy collapses. Gulf Arab states watching that moment would draw their own conclusions about American resolve. The cost of backing Washington's play suddenly outweighs the benefit, and the gravitational pull toward Beijing as an alternative power center intensifies overnight. This is not hypothetical. Military strategists are issuing these warnings in real time. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a choke point for oil. It has become a live stress test of the entire post-Cold War international order. The order, where American naval dominance guarantees freedom of navigation, where the dollar anchors global trade, where no regional power can unilaterally shut off the world's energy supply without consequence. Iran thought it could hold that order hostage with 1,000 speedboats, a field of naval mines, and the patience to wait Washington out. The USS Spruance blew a hole in that theory. Literally. But the ceasefire expires Wednesday. Talks in Islamabad may restart Tuesday, or they may not. Trump has threatened to knock out every power plant and bridge in Iran if no deal is reached. Iran's parliament speaker says the gaps remain enormous. And somewhere in the South China Sea, Beijing is watching every single move. So here's the question that will define the next chapter of this story.